just kind of came with with late breaking news with regard to her brother. Her brother has COVID. He lives in Lubbock, and so she clearly is concerned about that. And we would like to ask for your prayers and have you be thinking about him.
What's his name, brother?
His name is Robert Jetter. Jetter. That's his last name. Robert Jetter. So, well, once again, we're in the book of some reason or the other. I'm not getting much cooperation tonight. What is my issue here? The Bible never has an issue, you know, that's the thing. Well, I may need to ask for someone to turn things back there, I suppose. But we are in Hosea chapter 4, so why don't we kind of jump off into that. And the best place to start, of course, whenever we're doing that, is very simply to read it. So read with me, Hosea chapter 4. We're going to start in verse 1. Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, for the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land, because there is no faithfulness or kindness or knowledge of God in the land. There's swearing, deception, murder, stealing, and adultery. They employ violence so that bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore, the land mourns, and everyone who lives in it languishes, along with the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky, and also the fish of the sea disappear. Yet, let no one find fault, and let none offer reproof. For your people are like those who contend with the priest. So you will stumble by day, and the prophet also will stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you've rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being my priest. Since you've forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. The more they multiplied, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory into shame. They feed on the sin of my people and direct their desire toward their iniquity. And it will be like people, like priests, so I will punish them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. They will eat, but not have enough. They will play the harlot, but not increase, because they have stopped giving heed to the Lord. Harlotry, wine, and new wine take away the understanding. My people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's rod informs them. For a spirit of harlotry has led them away, and they played the harlot, departing from their God. They offer sacrifices on the tops of the mountains and burn incense on the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Therefore your daughters play the harlot, and your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they play the harlot, or your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with harlots and offer sacrifices with temple prostitutes. So the people without understanding are ruined. Though you, Israel, play the harlot, do not let Judah become guilty. Also do not go to Gilgal or up to Beth-aven and take the oath as the Lord lives. Since Israel is stubborn like a stubborn heifer, can the Lord now pasture them like a lamb in a large field? Ephraim is joined to idols. Let him alone. Their liquor is gone. They play the harlot continually. Their rulers dearly love shame. The wind wraps them in its wings, and they will be ashamed because of their sacrifices. Wow. Hosea is like really in a bad mood. Actually, it's God that's in the bad mood, right? Because of what has gone on. Looking at the first verse, he says, listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, for the Lord has a what? A case Interesting. Now the word here can also mean, well, we might put it this way. I've got a bone of contention with you. I got a bone to pick with you. Yes. Controversy. Yeah, that's the idea. Now, sometimes when this word is used, it's actually used in sort of a legal way. That it's something you might bring to the courts. But the point here is that God is really pretty upset, and for really good reason. And he has 3 complaints specifically for what's going on here. What are the complaints that he has?
There's no truth or work or knowledge of God in the land.
That's right. No faithfulness, in other words, loyalty. No kindness, in other words, compassion. And no knowledge. In this context especially, he's talking about intimate knowledge, right? Really knowing God, having a relationship and love. That's God's complaint. And he's addressing this whole thing again, looking at chapters 1 through 3, which is what we've been taking a look at up to this point. How is God framing this for the Israelites? For Israel and Judah. How's he framing this? This is an adultery, he's saying. You guys, we were in covenant like a marriage, and you've gone off and played the harlot everywhere, and you haven't even come home. You sold yourself as a slave. Oh my goodness, what's going on with you? I've got a case against you. Because he says in the land there is no faithfulness. There is no kindness. There is no knowledge. And again, he's not talking about the head knowledge. He's talking about the relationship knowledge. Instead, he says, we end up finding swearing, deception, murder, stealing, and adultery. They employ violence so that bloodshed follows bloodshed. What's filling up the land? What's the first thing he lists here? Swearing. Is he talking about cussing here? Well, he might be talking about cussing. He might also be talking about swearing falsely, because some of them were doing that sort of thing. Sounds really familiar, doesn't it? Yeah, there's a lot of that stuff going around. And by the way, to your point, if God was angry with Israel and Judah over this, what do you suppose? Might he still be angry when people in any country does it? Certainly. There's swearing, there's deception, there's murder, there's stealing, he says. There's adultery. And this adultery that he's making reference to, as we can see a little bit later on, like in verses 11 through 14, this adultery is not just a spiritual adultery. This is an actual adultery he seems to be making reference to. There's all this stuff going on, including violence, so that what generates what? Still in verse 2. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. What's that talking about? Well, it's a little bit of Chicago, a little bit of New York City, I suppose. But this is the sort of stuff that is still going on, by the way, in the Middle East and probably on the streets of Chicago as well. It's about revenge. One guy does something to me, well, I got to get even with him. And if you cut my brother, I'm going to cut you. And on it goes. You're going to shoot me, shoot at me, I'm going to shoot at you. It's this revenge. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Violence is everywhere. And he says that's what's going on. It just doesn't look good. And that's the reason, he says, that the land is mourning. The land is mourning, he says. What's he talking about there? What's one of the things that God frequently ends up giving to Israel as a punishment for their unfaithfulness and disobedience and so on? That was the ultimate threat. I'm going to take you off into exile. I'm going to take you off into slavery. But actually, God in his compassion actually had some lesser punishments early on. What were some of those lesser punishments? Crops. Yeah, listen, if you're going to treat me this way, then I'm just going to take away the farms. We're going to have a drought. We're going to have all kinds of people are going to be starving to death. Disease sometimes was a part of it as well. All of it. What was that? What was that? Families, yeah, exactly. Families and children. And sometimes it even ended up being wars coming through there, because I think I mentioned this last week. When you take a look at exactly where Israel is positioned, it's the land bridge between really three different great empires in the world. The Hittites that were up in Turkey, the Babylonians and Assyrians that were kind of in Mesopotamia, and the Egyptians that were down, of course, in Africa. If you're going to get to any one of those, you got to go right through Israel. And as you do so, quite frequently, as they say, an army moves on its stomach. Well, how are you going to feed your army? You take the crops. And so that was one way in which God sometimes ended up punishing Israel. And that's the reason he says here, the land is mourning. Look at what else he says. Everyone who lives in it languishes, along with the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, the fish of the sea. Even they disappear. Which isn't, by the way, terribly unusual, because what happened actually with the world after Adam and Eve sinned? What happened with the world? Exactly. Exactly so. Exactly so. In fact, the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 8 ends up talking about how it is that the entire creation has actually been groaning, he says, since the time of Adam and Eve. And that the entire creation, as a matter of fact, is looking forward to the day of resurrection, because there's something better coming along, Paul implies, which is going to be the new heaven and new earth. But the point, at least, is very simply that there truly was effect on the world. What men do ends up affecting all of the world, and that's what was happening here. He says, you want to know why your crops are failing? You want to know why it is that you're hungry? You want to know why there's drought? Well, I'll give you a hint. It's because of your spiritual adultery. That's what's been going on, he says. Let's see if I can catch up here. Finally got my thing to cooperate here. Okay. Yet, verse 4, no one finds fault. Was this the attitude of the people regarding these sins? What was it? We hear it all the time today. If someone says something about somebody else doing something wrong, what's the first thing that comes out of their mouth? Don't judge me, right? Which is, in other words, to say, yeah, what you may be saying is wrong, but I don't want to hear it. Thank you very much. I just don't want to hear it. That was going on right here. That's what he's making reference to. Now, you know, this is the attitude that they had. Don't tell me I'm wrong. For your people, he says, are like those who contend with the priest. Now, that one's not necessarily a real super obvious one, but think about with me for a minute, what were priests supposed to do according to Scripture? First of all, what do priests generally do?
Try to counsel people how to be right with God.
That's true. That was actually the second one I was going to go to. They give counsel about how to get right with God. But in both both true religion as well as in pagan religion. Basically, what priests boil down to is they are the intermediary between the gods and men. And so that's really the first job of the, and by the way, the reason I'm making reference to this, because it comes up again later in this chapter. Priests are supposed to be the in-betweens between God and men. But secondly, to your point, Jim, they're also to be teachers. They're also to be teachers. That was the job that was given to them by Moses. You are to teach the people all this law. That was going to be their job. Now, did they do a good job of that? Apparently not so good, because most of the people were pretty ignorant about what God really wanted and expected of them. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 8 through 12, talks about the fact that priests were supposed to be teachers. So another way to say verse 4 might be what? Your people are like those who contend with the priest. What's another way of saying that? Are arguing with him. Yeah. Your people are like those who are back talking to the teacher. You don't know what you're talking about. I know better than that. And by the way, this doesn't sound even a little bit familiar, does it? You don't know what you're talking about, Bible. You don't know what you're talking about, preacher. You don't know what you're talking about, elder. I know what I'm doing. I've got it under control, etc. Well, so what's wrong with contending with a priest or a teacher?
Not doing their job, obviously.
Not doing their job, that's true. Disobedience, yeah. And by the way, the priest theoretically was supposed to know what they're talking about. And the student does not. That's the difference between a teacher and a student, right? 2 + 2 = 5. No, it doesn't, Johnny. Yeah, it does. No, it doesn't, Johnny. You don't know what you're talking about, Johnny. So the point being very simply is that this is what was going on. They were basically saying that no one should find fault with me. No one should offer reproof. I'm like one who contends with a teacher. I'm hearing all the time. They're saying, what you're telling me I'm doing is incorrect. I shouldn't be doing this. But you can't tell me that. I know better than that. I've got it under control. I know what I'm doing. And people still continue. Yeah. It's disrespectful as well. Exactly.
This is not exclusive to the Old Testament either.
No.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 10 and following, it talks about divisions or contentions or arguments among the church.
Yeah. These sort of things just continue to happen. And there apparently were even some folks in the Corinthian church that were kind of contending with Paul. You would think that they would know better than that, but apparently they didn't. And they were ready to kind of argue with him about various things. Well, going on to verse 5, he says, so you will stumble by day, and the prophet also will stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother. Who's the prophet that he's making reference to here, do you suppose? I'm not looking for a name in particular, but kind of who the prophets that Hosea is kind of talking about here, who they might be. Could be prophets of Baal, and very likely they might be, but they could also end up being even prophets of God, or at least that's what they claimed. You guys remember the story about, the famous one about Jeroboam, where he ends up setting up a calf. And by the way, an awful lot of what we're taking a look at here, I think does end up directly relating to what's known in the Old Testament as the sin of Jeroboam. And the sins of Jeroboam basically boil down to this. It's not that Jeroboam was trying to change gods. He wasn't trying to change the object of worship. He was just trying to tinker with the pattern that God had given. And so, despite the fact that God said no images, he decided to set up a calf in Dan and a calf in Bethel, which, by the way, is also sort of mentioned here as Beth Aven. Beth-aven was another name for Bethel. And so if you end up then having these two calves that are out there, then in addition to that, he also said, well, you can, it's kind of silly for us to have priests only from the Levites. Let's let anyone who wants to be a priest, let them be a priest, and so on. But now you might recall at the, shall we say, the initiation of the Bethel altar, there's a priest, a true priest of God, not priest, but a true prophet of God, who comes and prophesies against the altar and so forth, and actually makes a prophecy about a certain Josiah that would come and basically tear down the altar and burn the bones of the priests that were sacrificing there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then the prophet says, now I'm going to leave. I'm making a long story short. There's other stuff that went on here. But that now I'm going to leave. So he goes back by a different way. And so one of the attendees of this particular event apparently was the son of another prophet, not necessarily a faithful prophet, apparently. And so this prophet says, well, I'm going to saddle up and I'm going to go chase this other prophet down and tell him to come back and have dinner, which God had told the first prophet you can't do. Don't want you to do that. Yeah, but the second prophet says, God has told me that he's changed his mind. And so you can do that now. So the first prophet says, well, okay. And he goes back and he does have dinner there, but on the way back, what happens to him? He gets eaten by a lion. And the lion didn't kill him because he was hungry. Normally, when lions kill you, it's for what reason? They're hungry. They don't just kill just for fun. They kill because they're hungry. But the lion wasn't eating him. In fact, the donkey was sitting right there, and he wasn't eating the donkey either. And everybody was passing by going, well, this is kind of weird. But I guess what I'm trying to say is there were plenty of prophets of God who were, shall we say, prophets for hire. They'll tell you what you want to hear. And that's what he's talking about here. You will stumble by day, and the prophet also will stumble with you by night. Now, why? Yes.
Translates here it says, the last part of verse 4, for with you is my contention, O priest, you shall stumble by day. The prophet also shall stumble with you by night. That would destroy your mother.
Yeah.
So it seems like he's saying whether you follow the priest or you follow the prophet, you're still wrong.
You're still wrong because both of them were saying the wrong things. Whether you're following the priest or whether you're who was telling everybody it's okay to come worship at Dan or at Bethel when the real place to worship was Jerusalem. It's okay to do all that stuff and to worship on the high places because that's what these high places that you read about so often in the Old Testament basically were all about. They were, in fact, on hilltops, but in some cases, they were worshiping Baal and Asherah. In other cases, they were worshiping Yahweh. But they were worshiping the wrong way. But the prophets and the priests were all saying, it's all right. What difference does it make? You're worshiping the same God. You're still offering him sacrifices. What difference does it make? Well, of course, it made a huge bit of difference to God. And God was very angry about that for the entire history of Israel's history, calling it again the sin of Jeroboam, that he had led Israel off down this path that they did not end up returning from. So when he's talking then about stumbling, he's talking about basically leaving the path. He's talking about sin. That's what he's making reference to in this particular passage. And he talks here about your mother being destroyed. What do you suppose it means by that? And who's the mother here that he's making reference to? The nation. Exactly so. That's what he's talking about. Your mother is going to be destroyed. The nation is going to be destroyed. Why? Well, because look at all the stuff you're doing. Look at all the immorality that you're engaged in. And then look at your worship even. That's off the charts. What are you guys thinking? He's saying. It's going to destroy you. Therefore, my people, he says, verse 6, rather famously, my people are destroyed, he says, for lack of knowledge. Because you've rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being my priest. Since you've forgotten the law of God, I will also forget your children. What was the problem as far as God was concerned? Very simple. We've repeated this over and over again. Knowledge. Knowledge. He says, my people are destroyed for lack of data? No. Relationship. That's what he's making reference to here. And God calls the Jews priests. Was this true? Were all the Jews priests? The answer is yes. Remember in the book of Deuteronomy, he ends up, I'm sorry, not Deuteronomy, it's the book of Exodus. God says, I'm going to make you priests. All right. So now we have a little bit of a head scratcher, right? Because who are supposed to be the real priests? The Levites, right. So in what sense then, as God is talking to the Jews, and he says, I will make you priests. And by the way, this ends up being quoted in 1 Peter, right? And this, in this particular instance, it's calling who priests? We're priests. And we proudly bear that badge, but sometimes we don't know what that means. So let's talk about what does it mean when God was calling Israel priests, all of them. Remembering again what it was that priests do. What do they do, Jim? The go-betweens. And the other thing that you'd made mention of, they're also supposed to teach. So who were Israel, am I saying that right? Who was Israel supposed to be, I'm going to make up a word here, priesting to? Who are they supposed to be priesting to? The world. They were supposed to be the mediators between God and the rest of the world. They were supposed to be teaching what God wants from mankind to the world. That was their position. That's why God called them priests. Now, later on in the book of Romans, did you notice that? Stick your finger here where we are. Turn to the book of Romans. Look with me into chapter 2. And we're going to start reading in verse 17. But we're going to be going down to verse 24. He says, but if you bear the name Jew and rely upon the law and boast in God and know his will and approve the things that are essential to being instructed out of the law and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of the immature, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and of the truth, you therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that one should not steal, do you steal? You who say that one should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, through your breaking the law, do you dishonor God? For the name of God is what? Blasphemed, not honored, is blasphemed among the Gentiles. Why? Because of you, just as is written. What an indictment. God's purpose for them was that they should be a light to the world. God's purpose for them, and certainly not the only reason that God wanted to work with the Jews, because he needed to have someone through whom the Messiah was going to come, right? That was also a part of the plan as well. And this is not necessarily, by the way, something that is, how shall I put this? This is not an indictment or anti-Semitic stuff, because you know what? Who else is called priests? We are. Does any of this have application to us sometimes? Sadly, yeah. If we are priests, then part of what our job is to be a light. Part of our job is to intercede to the rest of the world, be praying for the rest of the world, be reaching out to the rest of the world. This is my personal opinion, this is a wonderful evangelistic sermon, okay? Because it's a part of what our job is as priests. We wear that name proudly, and whenever it comes time for the priesthood of all believers, well, we're all into that, and so we all lead, all the men lead singing and prayer and so on and so forth, and we're really glad about that. But that's not all that there is to being a priest, you see. It's also about teaching the law and helping the world to see what Christianity, what God wants of every man, and teaching about God to every man, so that the world can really be filled of God, not just the data, but the relationship. So anyway, all right, I waxed the elephant on that one. Because, on the other hand, he says, because you've rejected knowledge, the relationship, I also will reject you from being my priest. Since you have forgotten the law of God, I also will forget your children. What does he mean by forgetting your children? Yeah. And once again, he's kind of making reference to the nation. Once again.
You think it's because people get the law,
I think there's a lot to that, for sure. You've got to teach what God has said. You've got to. Yeah. Which, of course, is precisely what happens. I don't know, Jim, if you've had the sad experience of trying to encourage some parents to bring their kids to Bible school and teach them at home and so on and so forth, and end up hearing the response being something to the effect of, well, you know, when I was a kid, I just had religion shoved down my throat, and I wanted to let my kids make up their own mind about what they were going to believe. So I'm not teaching them anything. You know what the result of that is? Agnosticism, atheism, and an awful lot of what we've got today. Because children don't know, and they don't know. And that's so crucial. Somebody else had a hand.
I have a friend who went through that several years ago that his mom stuck her in down.
Yeah.
He walked away from it. But now I think he's going to go.
Maybe Mama was right. Well, you know, and I oftentimes kind of end up scratching my head, because these are the same people who, if you were to ask them, so do you make your children go to school? Yeah. Well, of course you. Well, I hated brushing my teeth, so I'm never going to brush my teeth again. Really? I hated going to school, so I'm not going to make my kids go to school. Really? Well, you can go to jail for that one. And it's just kind of silly. Okay, some people don't like school, but an education nonetheless is pretty important. Maybe it's kind of inconvenient to brush your teeth because you're sleepy just before you go to bed, or whatever the other reason might be. But it's still kind of good for your teeth in the long haul, so you actually have some choppers by the time you're 30, you know. So the point is just kind of, it's sad and a little on the silly side sometimes. But yeah, we must teach if we're going to reject the law, then certainly we're not going to teach to our children, and our children will be forgotten by God. Trying to make sure I don't go over time. The more they multiplied, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory, he says in verse 7, into shame. Now, multiplying was considered to be a blessing, but the more they were being blessed, the more they were sinning. So what does it mean then that he was going to turn their glory into shame? What were they glorying in? Their sins, their idols, all of their, they were cutting edge of the religion of God. We're not bound by all these traditions. Why, we can do whatever we want to do. That's right, we're bad. And all these things that they were doing that were wrong. Thinking nothing is in the world wrong with any of this stuff. This is just the way, they're saying to themselves, this is just the way it was supposed to be. When God is saying, no, not even close. So I will turn your glory into shame. How is he going to do that? Well, when Israel was taken off into captivity, guess what happened to all these temples and high places and everything else of the sun? Destroyed. And all these prayers they were offering, what happened to them? Never made it above the ceiling. Your glory would become your shame, he says. They feed on the sin of my people and direct their desire toward their iniquity. It's these priests and the non-Levite priests and the false prophets that were feeding on the sin of the people. And they were doing so because they were telling the people exactly what they wanted to hear. What would you like for me to preach about this week? Or what subjects should I avoid when I'm talking to you? Or, how shall I soothe your guilty conscience? Jim?
Well, in essence, since the priest was leaving off the sin offering, it went to the priest.
Yep.
It's almost like they were encouraging the people to sin more so they could make that sin offering. So the money would come to us.
The money and the food would come to them. That's right, because a part of a priest's payment is that he would end up being part of the animal that was sacrificed. So the more sacrifices there are, the fatter I get. That's kind of the way that would work. Well, our time is close to expiration, so we'll go ahead and kind of put a pin in it there, as they say. But I do think it important that we consider very carefully what it means to be a priest of God. We were talking about a little bit earlier. It is important to know and to understand that indeed there is a priesthood of believers. There is. But the other side of it is that also puts a great deal of, I'm going to use the word burden upon us. Responsibility, because we are to be a light in the world. We can't just be anonymous Christians in the world. That's not what the Lord called for. We're to be salt and light. And as we're salt and light, then the world can taste what it's like to be a Christian. The world can see, as a contrast to the darkness of the world, can see what light God is offering. And perhaps in thinking about some of that, you can see that maybe you haven't been the salt and the light that you need to be. You haven't been the priest that you need to be. Well, today is the opportunity that you have to change that in your life. If it is that perhaps you need to repent, then you can do that right where you sit. Change your heart, change your life. But if you'd like for the prayers of this congregation, we stand ready to pray with you and for you. And if it happens to be this evening, that after understanding and reading what the Scriptures have to say about becoming a Christian, that you want to place your faith in Jesus, repent of your sin, confessing Him as Lord, and obey Him in baptism, we stand ready to assist you in doing that. And we'll be happy to, in fact, we would rejoice to help you in that. This evening, then, if you have any need to